Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable, particularly to new faces. Nice to see you, and nice to see some returning people as well, especially some people I've not seen in a little while. So nice to see you. My name's Matthew Baird. I've been doing social housing recruitment now for best part of 11 years. I got a name about a year ago of the ethical social housing recruiter, and I've absolutely swung that flag as hard as I can because it was probably the biggest compliment I've ever had. Too many people in recruitment, I feel, don't really truly care about the sectors they work in, but I'm the co-chair of the board for Spring. I helped found the support exempt accommodation forum, and obviously founded this. So hopefully some of that comes through, that I do genuinely care about this sector, and I'm trying to change it from the inside. Someone asked me the other day, what's the point of the Social Housing Roundtable? What are we trying to do? And the drum I guess I keep banging is it's a free place for everyone to go to. I saw a thing come up just the other day, which was a new Inside Housing event coming up. I was like, okay, great. Registered as a member of Spring, 400 and something pound to go for a day. And it's these kind of things that are a problem, because so many people's voices need to be heard, and actually we don't always get the opportunity. So hence the roundtable, all the recordings that are available, and the discussion that goes on around it. Today should be a really, really interesting session. Darren and I met via LinkedIn a little while ago now. I know we tried to schedule this slightly earlier in the year and then had to slightly rearrange. But as soon as I've spoken to Darren about himself and the business, which I'll get him to introduce in just a minute, I felt it was a really important conversation to bring to the table, because trauma is something which comes up on a lot of our roundtables. We do discuss it. It does come up as a regular conversation piece. But I think it's something as well that we can easily kind of step around and maybe not get into the cruxes of. So when Darren said he could bring this to the table today, it was an absolute no-brainer. So without further ado, Darren, I'll pass over to you, I guess, introduce the topic for today and indeed your business and how it's come about. So over to yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Morning, everybody. So my name's Darren Beattie, and I've got a company called Trauma Informed Services, which I set up approximately about 12 months ago. I've also got another hat on, actually. I'm in the process of setting up a family assessment centre, and for those that have not heard of one of those, it's basically where parents go to have to be assessed, essentially, whether they should keep their children or the children should go into care, and they're there for about 3 to 4 months. It's a 24/7 provision, and often the parents, and mums in particular, will come from hospital straight to that setting. That's going to be open in March, and it's going to have eight bedrooms there. And that's obviously a huge responsibility, because we're making life-changing decisions there. So that's my other hat. And I'm not talking about that today. I'm talking about the trauma. What I try to talk about is being trauma informed, and what does that look like for organisations. A little bit of background for me. So I started as a police officer in the 90s. Before then, working with children within youth offending. I then managed a number of community services, targeted services, working with really vulnerable families and children, and people in the community. And then really, my career, I think, in terms of understanding trauma, really changed in 2010 when I became a manager of a secure children's home. And for those that have never been to a secure children's home, it is as it sounds. So it does look like, and they can look like, quite prison-like. There's a large fence, and the children that are there have to go through a court process, and they're there, and their liberties restricted because of the risk they present to themselves or others. So over a period of 12 years, within that service, we had care colleagues, health colleagues, and education colleagues all working together as a multidisciplinary team to work with the most complex children in care. And the children have all been in care, but they've got significant traumatic histories, and that presents itself in really dangerous behaviours and risky behaviours. So essentially, they would, present with either significant self-harming to the point of wants to commit suicide, or present with violence and really want to try and hurt other people. It was a hugely challenging job, but it was also hugely rewarding. And when I took the job on, I think we were working in a very different way. And what happened, we got funding from NHS England to input clinical resources, and we had psychologists and psychiatrists and mental health canvas practitioners come onto the team. And that really changed the way we were thinking about working with these children and really trying to make an impact and a difference. And that essentially led to working more trauma-informed with the children, having the training for the staff to make them trauma-informed, and then leading to what we call therapeutic parenting. And over 7 years, and it took a long time, we transformed the culture and the practice within that provision, and the outcomes for the children were far, far greater than when we first started. So I could talk about this all day, but I'm conscious we've got some time here. So I'm just going to bring up a few slides, but I just wanted to give you a bit of context on my background. All right, let's try this. Okay, can everybody see that? First slide, perfect.
All good. Feel free to open up into a full presentation.
Yeah, just going to do that now.
Fantastic.
Okay. Yeah, there's a little advisory warning here because we're going to talk about some subject matter that might be triggering and it could be unexpected. So please, if you need to take time, turn your screen off or leave and come back, then please do so. Okay, so what do we mean by trauma? There's a nice quote here which relates to trauma, refers to the way that some distressing events are so extreme or intense that they overwhelm the person's ability to cope, resulting in lasting negative impact. We'll come on to a little bit more about that shortly. There are different types of trauma. You've got the one-off event, which could be a road traffic accident. You've got war and conflict, which obviously for your sector is quite an important one in terms of refugees and people coming into housing. We've got oppression and racism and hate crime. And then the stuff I'm going to talk a little bit today is that my experience is developmental and complex trauma. So developmental or complex trauma is the term used to describe the impact of early repeated trauma and loss, which happens within a child's important relationships and usually in early life. And I think the key there is repeated. And what I'm talking about here is abuse, whether that's sexual, physical, neglect, any other type of abuse that a child's had growing up in those early years. And I just want to talk a little bit, there's a little clip here, a little film. NHS Scotland have been pioneers really in really taking this forward from an organisational perspective. And they've set about a framework for ensuring that everybody working in NHS Scotland is trauma-informed no matter what role. And they've put a huge amount of resources and a whole framework together to make sure this happens. It's been signed off by the ministers in government in Scotland. They're the first large organisation to take these steps, and they've produced some great resources, and this is one of them. Just a second.
There's no sound coming through, Darren. We might need to share it at a later date. That's all right. I can share that around the group. That's not a problem. Could you make it full screen, Darren? It's kind of cutting some of it off for us.
Yeah, I'll just try again. Hold on. I'm not quite sure. It's not giving me the function there. There we go. Is that sound coming through?
No, we've got no sound.
Okay.
Apologies for this, everybody, with the slight technical issues here. No, we've now got your kind of Windows thing come up. Working.
Whenever Mum went away, he would come into my room. He said I made him do it, and that it meant he loved me. It always made me feel powerless, ashamed.
I never knew when an argument would turn into a fight. I was always scared, always on edge, always had to be ready to defend myself.
My late husband was very controlling, always put me down, told me what to wear or cook. He'd get angry if I didn't do things right. I had no choice or control. It made me feel useless. I had no confidence in the end.
So I zoned out, pretended it wasn't happening. It's so difficult to trust people now. I just freeze and float away in my head when I feel powerless.
Now I just get angry a lot, feel like I want to fight. Sometimes I worry I'm just like him.
I find it difficult to do things myself, and I get really nervous when I have to talk to new people. I avoid them when I can.
What we went through was traumatic because we were harmed, physically, emotionally, and felt like we were in real danger.
Traumatic experiences can be things that happen once, like a serious accident or assault.
Or it can be where traumatic things keep happening, like physical or sexual childhood abuse, or domestic abuse, or relationships where you can't be yourself, where you're put down or bullied.
It can make you feel powerless, trapped, or betrayed. The sense of confusion, shame, or fear can be overwhelming, especially if there is no one you feel able to tell. Even after it's over, it's harder to get on with life and feel safe.
Trauma is more common than most people think. Almost 1 in 5 adults has experienced physical or sexual abuse in their childhood.
And more than a quarter of all women have experienced domestic abuse.
Some people recover after traumatic events. Some people aren't affected as much. Having good, safe, supportive relationships with other people can really help. But lots of people continue to be affected by trauma, sometimes long after it happened.
For most of us, traumatic or adverse childhood experiences like these affect our body's response to stress, affecting our physical health as well as our mental health. The impact of trauma can also make it harder for us to learn and to realise our full potential.
One of the most worrying things about the experience of trauma is that it can make us avoid people and places, even if they are there to help, like doctors, teachers, social workers, carers, colleges,
Councils, community centres, employers, advisors. Because most trauma experiences happen in relationships with other people, we can find it difficult to trust people or feel safe. And sometimes the way we react to help ourselves feel safe pushes people away and makes it even harder to get the help we need.
It's like our brains learn survival tricks to get us through the trauma at the time, like priming us for danger.
Making us run away.
shutting down when we feel upset.
It might look like we have a short fuse, like we're unfriendly, or we're just a bit absent.
Anything, however small, that reminds us of that trauma can set off our own unique trauma response to protect ourselves, making us avoid the people and places that we need the most. Like you. But there are things you can do to help me trust you enough so I feel safe and I don't shut down or avoid you. You can offer me a different relationship that doesn't remind me of the one I had when I was a kid. One where I feel safe, I feel empowered, and I have choice and control over what happens to me. One where we work together and I can trust you. This is called being trauma-informed in the way you work.
Being trauma.
Oh, we've lost it. Darren, no, we've lost the video, pal. Oh, I mean, it was a good. We'll definitely get that link shared around anyway.
We'll be taking someone else instead. Do you have any preferences about who comes instead?
Well, I'd feel more comfortable with someone I've met before. Most importantly, I'd like a woman.
Well, how about June? She's worked with us for 3 years. If there's anything you'd like her to do that Heather normally does, just ask.
Trauma-informed means empowering me to have control and take an active role in what happens to me.
We know some people don't like coming to the dentist, so is there anything that you're worried about or scared of? I can tell you each step I'm doing, so there are no surprises if you'd like. If you need me to stop, how will you tell me?
Trauma-informed means helping me to trust you by being clear about what will happen. Doing what you say you will do when you said you would do it.
Unfortunately, our advisors are running about 30 minutes late. I'm so sorry about that. Are you able to stay, or can we make another appointment for you?
Many of us at work will have had our own experiences of trauma in our own lives, or we might witness or hear about it in the course of our work. So the same principles apply to all of us. We all need to take care of ourselves by making sure we're safe and connected to the people and activities that matter to us. Can you think of anyone you've met or worked with recently that a trauma-informed approach would have made a difference to? Are there any trauma-informed changes you might make that could make a difference?
So if you offer me safety and choice, if you collaborate with me and empower me and help me trust you, then you will help me work with you. Even if I only meet you once, even briefly, you can give me a different kind of relationship. One where I feel valued and valuable, connected and safe.
And when that happens over and over again with everyone that I meet, I can learn that it's safe to make connections with people.
It is those connections that we all need to access life chances and reach our full potential.
Thanks, Darren.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Can you hear me okay there?
Yeah, I've got you now. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms
Okay.
of, so yeah, go on. Was that the end of the presentation? Just so I, yeah, sorry.
No, it wasn't actually, but that was just the film. But obviously, I think hopefully, and I'm conscious of time here. What time have we got till now? Is it 12 o'clock?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are some other slides I've got on here, but I think the film really, hopefully, just illustrates what I'm trying to talk about really, which is the impact of trauma as on people, not only as children, but in terms of their adult lives. And there's a real challenge for organisations to understand that, and I'm really pleased NHS Scotland have produced some of this stuff really. But essentially, it's about how can we make those interactions with people meaningful, because we're not going to know of potentially, trauma, but the data and the stats suggest that there's a lot of people that have experienced that. In fact, I've just got a few stats there really. I mean, 25% of the adult population in prison have been in care. It's just, we're just failing as a corporate parent, I think. 60% of sex workers in the UK have been in care. 1 in 3 children experience traumatic event by the time they're 18, and 1 in 5 adults have experienced domestic abuse. So trauma's all around us, and I just wonder, how are we sort of managing that? Not only for the people that have experienced a trauma, but also just in terms of the staff and people working with them and the impact it has on them as well, which we sometimes call the secondary trauma. I was just thinking about, I went to the doctors the other day, the GP surgery, and I was actually thinking that's probably the worst example of not being trauma informed in terms of A, trying to get an appointment, B, when you go into the reception itself and it's very closed windows and really nobody really wants you to be there. It's quite a hostile environment usually, in terms of it's not really friendly and welcoming. And yet this is the GP service that we expect to be visiting on a fairly regular basis. And I'm thinking some of those people, and the example in the film of that would be a huge challenge for a lot of those people, just in terms of just going to the GP or trying to make an appointment. So for that, we just have to adapt the way we work. And it's only small changes, but actually can make big differences. There's something about ACEs here, and again, that sort of adverse childhood experiences, and there's been a huge correlation between adverse childhood experiences and also health, in terms of some of the physical health conditions and the research that's been taking place in America. And there's a whole questionnaire here, which you can see, and essentially, the more you tick of those, the more likelihood you're going to potentially have health conditions. But there are some, it's not a fact, there's some conditions around that in terms of protective factors and relationship factors that can prevent that from happening still. And there are significant links with some other chronic mental health problems, suicide, and some of the physical around heart disease, cancer, etc. And sometimes
we can't see your screen at the moment, Darren. I don't know if you're still showing a presentation. We can't. If you're cycling through that, that's why we can't. But I think what's interesting, some of the stats that you mentioned, certainly, because obviously I want to, bring people in is when we look at housing, and actually Claire's mentioned it in the chat there, that the video is really powerful. And what strikes her though is that there's so many people affected by trauma. We should treat everyone with kindness and care, because in housing and other sectors, we often need to know what kind of trauma people have been through before we can start doing anything. And I know when we launched, when we put up the announcement about this today on LinkedIn, so many people saying, well, there's the trauma of, obviously tenants, there's the trauma of our frontline workers, there's the trauma of managers who've been frontline workers and worked their way up and through. There's so much trauma in this sector. What are businesses like yours doing to try and help, I guess, support and really get to the depths of what we can do to, I hate the word mitigate, but support in the best way that we possibly can, because there's trauma everywhere in the housing sector. Hello, Darren, can you hear me?
Oh, sorry about that. Sorry, I thought that was a question to the
no, sorry, to yourself. That was all.
Yeah, there isn't a quick answer to this. There are some key things which I think were mentioned in the film, which relate to sort of how to work with someone and how to work together in relation to the key principles of trauma informed practice, which is safety, choice, collaboration, trust, and empowerment. I think these are the key values, really. And actually, if we take safety, for example, that could just be me making sure that your first admission process or first coming into contact with the service is really welcoming, and it's just thought about, and it's friendly, and it's approachable, and it's well decorated, and it's a warm welcome as opposed to being cold. So there are things that can be done quite easily. And I think if you were to think about your own service or your own organisation, and just really reflect and think about that, are you doing that? Is the question. Is that happening already? If it is, that's fantastic. If it isn't, what could be improved? What simple things could be improved to do that? Just reminding people of their rights and responsibilities, and also just giving them those various options of how to have appointments, and whether that's virtual, whether it's on the telephone, whether that's, I think what happens is we get stuck in process and we follow process, but actually in these sort of circumstances, process isn't helpful. We just have to be thinking a bit more wide and a bit more creatively around how we can engage those, what we might call hard to reach or difficult to engage or problem families in a slightly different way. And that usually involves compassion and empathy and just curiosity and understanding, finding out a little bit more about them so you can start building that trust. And trust is probably one of the key elements of it, really.
Certainly seems to be. I know there's a point there from Esther in the chat. Senior leaders of services need to invest in working in a trauma-informed manner. This helps staff and people in services to feel supported, engaged, and that their voice will have an impact to shape services. And I think that's one of the key things, is often, you know, when there is trauma going on, people don't feel they're heard. So I guess that ties back in with that trust piece you mentioned there, Darren, is that people just aren't feeling like they're, you know, if they do come forward about something, that anything's actually going to be done about it.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the frustration. And obviously in social care, there's an organisational responsibility there in terms of things like supervision and reflective practice and team meetings and case meetings to really try and discuss some of those issues, whether that's through on a personal basis or whether that's from an organisation team basis. And I'm not sure, you'd be able to tell me that, I'm not sure if those mechanisms are within housing really, and how much is that?
I think it really varies from
part of it?
provider to provider. I think this is the nature of the housing sector. People do things differently. And when you mentioned there about, you know, making things welcoming, we only have to go back to the outrage at you know, the Robert Jenrick decision to paint over the murals at the detention centre. And I think people are aware of trauma and understanding that, and understand the trauma obviously these young kids and things will have been through, and yet there's no empathy. So I think empathy is key. Claire, I'm going to bring you in.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so many things I could say, really powerful, but I just want to pick up on, Matt, you said about my comment, and you said that we need to know what people have gone through. We don't need to know what people have gone through, is what I was saying. We always think that we do need to know everything, but let's just treat everyone like that would be ideal. Treat everybody as if, not as if they're, you know, they've suffered trauma, but let's just treat everybody nicely and kindly. But one of the things I want to say about, you know, Darren, you're saying we need to, you know, build trust and have a welcoming, you know, approach to everyone. Absolutely agree. But so many of the issues that I'm seeing with this kind of problem that people are coming across, and complaints and so on, it gets worse and worse because the very basic thing at the beginning that should have happened hasn't happened. So somebody's got a complaint about, you know, a repair, and they've already told, you know, you said, you know, we share a bit about ourselves and we'll build trust, and the customer's already told the housing provider, oh, and I've got a severely autistic child, so you can't just turn up unannounced, you need to let me know what time you'll be there. And that doesn't get acted on. You know, they still turn up unannounced. So we're compounding it, which isn't useful. And then that leads to more trauma for the staff as well, because then quite understandably, they're getting a customer who's really, really angry now. So it just builds on it and builds on it. That's not helpful. That's just
And often trauma as well,
seeing.
Trauma as well for the tenant who's got people knocking on
Yeah.
the door. They've got a child now that's
Yeah.
going through everything, and it's
Yeah.
it is that blend of everything. And I know you and I have talked about data an awful lot, but those systems talking to each other and it being properly recorded when it needs to be, and
acting on the data that you've got. And
absolutely. And Esther's mentioned in the chat there that sometimes staff caseloads are so high and complex, they don't get the time and space they need to build that trust and rapport. So reflecting and having time to consider alternative ways of working, alternative ways of supporting people is so important to the impact of working in a trauma-informed way. And it is that balance, Claire. I completely agree with you, of knowing you don't need to know everything about someone, but and it would be lovely if everyone treated everybody wonderfully. But if you're also rocking up at a house where you know you can't act as you would with other people because you are working with individuals, you know, you could rock up somewhere and be all friendly and polite, and actually that's going to maybe trigger other stuff. This whole aspect of trauma is incredibly difficult, and I don't think it's a surprise when, you know, I don't know if anybody saw it this morning, but Inside Housing have published a report saying that turnover of housing officers is twice as high now as it was in 2017. Now, it dipped during the pandemic, and a lot of that from those I've spoken with is because people felt they couldn't quit their roles because people needed support. And yet actually now people are so tired, they're so burned out. I was talking to a homelessness case officer the other day who'd been advised that they should have a caseload no bigger than the amount of hours they work, and they worked 30 hours a week and their caseload was 75. And they were absolutely on their knees because nearly every 2-3 calls was about suicide because everyone's struggling so much. The support they have, because they haven't got the staff, isn't there. They're told, look, well, you've got to take the next call. Like, you can go and have 5-10 minutes sitting in a quiet room, whatever it will be, but that's about all you can do because we don't have the facilities to support you more there. And yet this is a person who gives them 12 months, they'll either leave that place, 12 months max, they'll leave the place, or they'll leave the sector completely. And in a sector which is already really struggling for trained staff because everybody's burned out and everyone's gone off and been an independent consultant because that's what people are doing because they're so tired. It's just exacerbating a problem when you've got really traumatized tenants, you've got really traumatized staff, and you've got managers who know that's going on but can't convince higher ups to hire 20 more staff because they also haven't got the capacity. It's a real struggle. Hazel, I'm going to bring you in and then go back to Darren on some of these points. Lovely.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, thank you. I'm really glad I could come today. Sorry, I'm Hazel and I work for Bromford, and many of you will know that we have a neighbourhood coaching model. It's been in practice for quite a few years now. And so we do have smaller patches. We do have a more intense relationship with our customers. And actually that does play a lot into trauma to do with how actually the colleagues are dealing with this. I'm just going to be really open today. We've had in one of our particular locations, a lot of suicide, unfortunately, and the impact and the ripple that that's had in particular locations has been really, really challenging, because these colleagues have built relationships up with their customers over a period of years quite often, and then something happens and there might not be a trigger. There's nothing that we've done. There's no safeguarding case. There's no domestic issues. It's just something that customers have been doing. There's no link to cost of living. So we're starting a project group around suicide to see what we can do, to see if we can improve our practice on this. So today is kind of really timely for us as an organisation, and I just welcome kind of getting a bit of a feel around the group if people are experiencing the same things, and the impact that's having on colleagues, and what resolutions have people got within your organisations that I might be able to tap into, because we need to move forward with this and we can't leave this situation hanging. We would really appreciate any kind of help.
I really appreciate that, Hazel. Is there anything that's been working for Bromford? Obviously, when having cases like that, it's incredibly difficult. But is there anything that's kind of, I know you've set up these working groups, but has it been just a matter of communication between, almost staff? Because I was talking with somebody from Places for People yesterday who's going to be coming on to a future roundtable, who I've, freely said on here before, I've issues with some massive housing providers because their patches are too big. They're reducing their patches to 500 because they have to, not just because of the TSMs and the pressure, but because of stuff like exactly what you're mentioning, because of the trauma going on.
Yeah, I mean, our patches are really small, they're around 200. So,
wow.
And I think the trauma that comes into the colleague kind of arena is the fact they have that relationship with that customer. There's very few non-engagers. And so the chances are if someone is either threatening suicide or, getting themselves into situations which are becoming traumatic for the colleagues, or if they do actually, complete their suicide, then it's really traumatic for that colleague dealing with it, and that's the thing, because they had that relationship and they really, they didn't see it coming. There was nothing there they could have done different. And I guess if you have bigger patches and less of a relationship, then the trauma on you as an individual may feel a bit less.
There's the other side of the coin. It's a real challenge. Claire, I'm going to bring you in on that point, because Esther said in the chat, having access to a trained counsellor to deliver reflective practice focusing on key topics such as suicide would be beneficial. I think sometimes these things are a challenge to try and get sign off, Esther, as I'm sure you're probably aware yourself, but it's this level of mental health support and need that is greater than it ever was. And we really doubled down on that during the pandemic time. And yet we seem to have kind of taken a step away from it now that things are very much, in quotation marks, back to normal, because it's a completely different world than it was 5-6 years ago. Claire.
Absolutely. That's just really hit me hard, Hazel. I was at Bromford when we were moving, or you were, I'm not at Bromford anymore, but as you know, a lot of us still talk about we when we talk about Bromford, because it's a wonderful place to work. And I was there when we were moving to that model, and that's not a risk that I think any of us were aware of. But I just wanted to say that there are people that I've found through LinkedIn. The one who jumps to mind is Nick Wilson, who is a suicide prevention campaigner and trainer and consultant. and he posted something this morning about statistics that disabled people are 3 or 4 times more likely to die by suicide than non-disabled people, which was shocking as well. Well, it's kind of not surprising, but it hits hard, doesn't it? So that there are definitely people out there who have access to advice and can offer advice. But yeah, I can really see how that's hitting colleagues with those relationships, as you say, Hazel.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I'll look Nick up, and it is location specific. It is only in one particular area of the business that this is happening. So we need to link in strategically with the NHS, you know, and in with mental health services, and get a feel for what else, and feedback as well. One of the things that I'm doing when I'm trying to kind of really understand so we can improve our responses to this is actually what's happening in the wider thing. Is this happening? Is it, you know, I doubt it's very much just because of our homes. I think it's probably location, and is there a challenge getting into other services, and we need to be strategic about this and make sure we're getting the flow going back up as well. Absolutely. And then that might reassure colleagues with some of the trauma they're experiencing. We're really dealing with this, and we're doing something quite, you know, about it. So and as Esther says, those colleagues need help as well, don't they? And you've got a colleague assistance programme, haven't you? We do. We've got a new one called ULife, and in fact, I checked this morning that all of the colleagues impacted are all using ULife and getting a really good experience from it. So that's been positive.
It is. It's. I mean, this challenge isn't going away. I think as the world. I mean, I hate to say it, but the news is probably more negative than it's ever been. There is a feel, certainly in Britain, amongst many that I speak to, that we're sat under this cloud we've been under for a number of years now, where people kind of are just. They're fed up with the government, they're fed up with the way the country's run, they're fed up with having no money, they're fed up with inflation. Everything is piling on, and everyone is just a bit lower. Even the weather, you know, is troublesome. We're being told careful because the world's burning and we're all gonna, you know, the world's gonna die, and then we're sat and it's raining and people are going, well, it's not good either way. Mental health in Britain, I think, has been struggling for a number of years, and I think these things are just exacerbating, and the lack of funding to services such as some of the mental health ones have been huge. There's a couple of comments in the chat, and then Darren, I'm going to bring you in just for some thoughts on what we've heard so far. So Caroline, lovely to see you, Caroline. Access to regular clinical supervision for staff is essential. Mental health transformation is underway in many areas. Gloucestershire has a new complex emotional needs service looking at new ways of working. They're looking at supporting the professionals who are supporting those with complex emotional needs. And Esther, mental health first aid, supervisions, debriefs, following incidents, check-ins, internal reflective practice if you can't outsource it, awareness and respond supportively to vicarious trauma that can impact people in different ways. I think what bothers me, and this just before I bring Darren in, is that sadly, none of this is new. And I think the problem I'm finding with housing, with some businesses, some are absolutely superb, and that isn't to take away, but with some businesses is that these services are available. They're available for tenants, they're available for staff. I think quite often we focus rightly on the front line, but as I said before, managers, heads of service that are dealing with everyday people coming in, their staff coming in, they're burned out, they're exhausted, but they're being told I can't hire more staff. So they're taking that onus on and just trying to lift everybody up. There's money. There is money for a lot of businesses in housing. The way it's spent sometimes is questionable. And I think it's about just trying to get those decision makers now to really look at this and go, look, we've no choice. This is, we have to hire more staff to share out that load more, but also we have to hire people like, you know, medical health first aiders, clinical, clinical psychologists to come in and check in on our teams, because it's all well and good having things like the ULife thing that Hazel mentioned, which is absolutely superb as a service. But in that moment, it isn't always where you go to. And particularly in a world where we're working more remotely, you can have very much a day where loads of stuff can happen. Like, actually, I don't want to burden someone else with this again. I'm just going to go home. And then you sit on it, and that exacerbates and exacerbates. Darren, from some of the conversations you've had today, and obviously your experience in this sector, have any thoughts, guidance, advice on what businesses can to be doing, like I say, not just to help staff, but to help tenants as well?
Yeah, I think there's two aspects, isn't it? There's the tenants, and then there's the impact on staff. And I think ideally, somebody suggesting to the chat would be perfect, you know, but is that realistic, and is that going to happen? Are they going to recruit psychologists to support the organisation, the teams? Is Is that realistic? If it is, great, then I think that should happen. You've obviously got the employee assistance programs, but and most organisations do, but I think you need more than that. And somebody made a comment about sort of debrief supervisions, incident checking, reflective practice internally. There's a lot you could do internally, but I think for that you also need the people in the workforce development and the skills and the knowledge to do that. So that's where it sits with your managers. You know, how much training, how much supervision training have your managers had? Because if they're really good at providing really good reflective supervision, then some of those issues could be resolved internally with support, externally with some professionals, with clinicians. So I think there's a lot that could happen within the sector to help. Clearly, by the sounds of it, you're also working in a broken system. It's a bit like social care. So people are trying to do the best with the resources they've got, and just on that hamster wheel, so you're firefighting constantly, and it's reactive as opposed to proactive working. And until the resources are there, until the resources are actually available to people, then unfortunately it's going to be really difficult to make any significant change.
I think that's a really, really fair point. And it's that kind of, I guess, mindset change that's the most difficult. I mean, by all means, you know, if anybody has any business, you know, if their business is doing something where they're really training managers, I'd love to hear from you, because it's that managerial support and day-to-day kind of head of support as well. I think that is so imperative, as is a culture coming down from the chief exec down, that, you know, this is seen as an absolute priority. I'm just going to quickly put something in the chat there, but by all means, if anybody wants to come in, then brilliant. But does anybody have a business they work for where there is real kind of truly valuable mental health support training for managers to manage their staff? Because I remember when I've managed teams, I've never really had that. Like, you just suddenly find out, oh goodness me, a member of your team's having an issue with XYZ, and you ask HR and you get a bit of advice and you kind of find your way through it. I see Alice has put in the chat there that she works with boards, but less so at exec level. There's a lack of knowledge at this level. I'd like to bring some of this information to them. And Darren, are you doing any work with boards at all? Is that something that's being requested?
We're doing work with organisations that are essentially working in what I would call trauma-related services. So essentially the ones that are working at management, senior management level and frontline, where they've bought into this. They've completely bought into the fact that they need to be trauma-informed as an organisation. And that means not only just for frontline practice, but for all of their policies, procedures, and it's reflected in everything that they do. And as I say, actually, a lot of it sounds quite difficult when you do a self-assessment and you can bring an action plan together. A lot of it is quick wins. Now, it takes time to change culture. We all know that. But the practice, and I really like what Claire said, actually, you know, if we all work this way, we work this way with everybody. I think that's the sort of gold standard, that's the utopia. But I also know that there are pressures, constant pressures and stresses on people that make that really, really difficult. So it's easy to go back to the way you've worked. That's, you know, your sorts of factory settings, as opposed to thinking, actually, there's probably a better way, a different way of doing this, but it's hard to begin with. And it takes time and practice, and to embed that type of thinking takes significant leadership buy-in.
Really interesting point, and backed up, I think, from that position made by Esther in the chat there, that said her managers all have PIE, which I think is psychologically informed environments, and TIC training, which I think is trauma informed something training. Apologies, trying to remember all my acronyms. But they're looking at rolling this out internally across our organizations, including core departments, which is absolutely brilliant to see. We're also looking at policies and making them more trauma informed, RSVs, debriefs, and safety planning, etc. So that's fantastic to see, and I think backs up some of Darren's points there. Tosin, I'm going to bring you in. Good to have you with us today.
Hi, how are you? Hi, everybody. Yeah, I think it's obviously a really, really touching topic for everybody, really, whether our customers or tenants. For us at the Pioneer Group, all managers and leads of departments all have been trained by the Mental Health Association. So we all are mental health champions. And like other people have said, it is being embedded in every area of the policies and procedures that we have within the business. But I just wanted to make a comment on what somebody else mentioned earlier. It is well and good to have the training and the tools to identify where we see staff, especially because obviously they are the ones who are dealing with customers when they themselves are falling short. But I don't think it's really been embedded properly, because if you have a training at the beginning of the year and you don't have any incidences that's occurred, the likelihood for you to have that retention of memory of what to do immediately is kind of going to be difficult. So I think I kind of agree with Darren when he said this is going to take a very conscious decision to do this, obviously, over and over and over again.
Would you agree that it needs almost a whole cultural change in housing across the board?
Exactly. And obviously this also kind of points me to the Awak Ishab case, where it's if the culture doesn't start to be changed totally and revamped, it's going to be very difficult. Everybody has good intentions, but unfortunately we are all busy. There are too many things on everybody's plate at every point in time to take that 2 seconds sometimes to just go, oh, actually, this person is looking a little bit different today. What's going on, and how could you, deep in further? So I'm
looking at the tenant side, Tosin, from your side with Pioneer Group, because I know obviously you do an awful lot of work in that space. Do you feel there's more of an issue with people hearing 50, 60, 70 times a year about suicide and those kind of things, so burning out and almost becoming numb to it? Or do you think the bigger issue is stigma around that and kind of going, oh, it's probably not as bad as they're saying it is, they're just, because of the stigma that happens in our sector? Do you think they lean one way or the other, or do you think it's across of both, or is that just part of the bigger circle?
That is what we're actually doing now at the moment. We're actually having culture conversations around the whole business and within teams. And in fact, it started off with the chief exec. And we've had one culture conversation with all the managers and team leaders. Team leaders are now taking it to their teams individually to look at everything. So it's not just trauma, but just how the culture is being disseminated within everybody within the business. And going forward, we're actually going to have a proper whole group meeting to talk about culture and how we can change it effectively from the customer perspective. I think it's a bit of both. Some people don't want to say what's wrong because they feel they'll get judged. And unfortunately, we still have people within housing who have the same modus operandi of, that's how they always behave anyway, because they want attention. So, it's all we can do is keep doing what we're doing now, and to make sure that those changes are effected. I hope that helps.
Really do. No, thank you so much. Darren, over to yourself.
Yeah, I think that's some really good points there made. And I think one of the challenges I had within an organisation, just 100 people, 100 staff, was blame culture. And I'd be interested to know what people's feelings are around blame culture within your sector. But that blame culture is hugely negative and hugely problematic if it's there. And I think the idea is changing some of being trauma-informed training is trying to change that thinking and those attitudes is just around having space and where you can feel trusted to have those really open conversations without feeling judged. And one of the suggestions that you might want to take away is we used to have staff wellbeing meetings on a weekly basis, and that was a real opportunity to really. And actually, there was no manager's presence; it was just doing the staff with a clinician. But actually, people were able to really talk about how they were feeling and the impact of the work on them. And feeling okay to say some of the things that I think would have one time be seen as a weakness, but actually over time that was recognised as a strength. So there are small things that can happen within your day, within your organisations that can happen now that over time will change thinking and practice and attitudes.
But what would you kind of advise, as I said earlier, to that? There's a business that I know of, it's a local authority. They have a home option service. They are so snowed under at the moment with the amount of referrals coming in. Homelessness is just becoming ever increasing. I'm sure Hazel will back me up on this. It's becoming a bigger and bigger issue all the time. There is more and more demand, and yet because of the nature of the way it's been developed over the last few years, there's nowhere near enough people trained in housing options. Any business is crying out for trained officers and not getting them, particularly around the legislation side of things. So when they're being told they can't hire, but they're getting all of this calls through every single day, I guess what is the answer? I mean, is there an answer, or is it just a case of going, this is never going to be fixed until
Well,
this business starts to hire?
If I was in charge of that organisation, the one thing I'd be saying is stop. Just stop what we're doing and
But
take some time.
The phone is literally never stopping ringing.
I know that. I guess what I mean, I don't mean that practically, but I mean, you do need someone to be in the background with your leadership team to say, this isn't working, this really isn't working, and what are we going to try and do? What are the quick wins to try and sort some of these out, and what is a long-term solution? But ultimately, we know we're going to keep carrying on. It's going to be a disaster, because you're going to have just complete burnout, and it's just not going to work for anybody. So at some point, I think there has to be even if it's not in the actual, you don't see it in the sense from a practical point of view, somebody in the background has got to say, we're going to stop what we're doing here.
Yeah, I guess it comes down to that cultural thing, top down, because at the moment that isn't happening, despite them being advised. Like I say, you're not meant to have caseloads bigger than your hours, and yet they're having it double, and it's still not changing. But the people that get affected most by all of it, unfortunately, the tenants who are going, well, hang on, I'm paying for this, what's going on? I agree with you completely. I almost think one of the reasons behind these roundtables is just to try and give the sector that shake-up that it needs, because it desperately needs it. I'm going to go to some of the points in the chat before we move on to the last 5 minutes, because again, the hour's flown by, but there's some really interesting points in there. Caroline, this is the challenge. It needs to be embedded at every level and in all aspects of the business. For a lot of housing, it means a whole system change. And I just couldn't agree more. And Anna said there, we have mental health first aiders, but I don't think they're widely called upon or promoted. And as Claire's pointed out, unfortunately, sometimes there's risks around mental health first aiders too, somewhat ironically. Anna, is there really that much of a difference between trauma-informed approach and resident-centered policies and process? The essence is to recognise that individuals should not be compromised for the sake of corporate convenience. And that's absolutely huge in terms of a mindset shift, that if we could get everyone in housing on board with that would be incredible. Let's not take away from the pressure the housing providers are on, and particularly when it comes to budgets and trying to be responsible for all the house building, it appears, in the UK at the moment, despite government targets not flowing that way. So it's really, really interesting. But the pressure on people who work in housing at the moment, I've never known anything quite like it. And there's always another thing coming on. Just when we think we're on top of this, there's a new legislation or policy that comes through. And Claire said, if housing worked how it should work, safe, secure homes, easy to access repair services, do we think there would be as much stress for both tenants and colleagues? And yeah, I mean, this is a massive part of it. I think on one side of it, we create more trauma for housing creates more trauma for itself by not getting the very, very basics right, in the way that I think everyone in this room is trying to get those basics right. I think very rarely does anybody come on these roundtables who is constantly fighting to kind of get those basics right. But we still need to remember that there's going to be some parts of the sector we work in, which is domestic violence, homelessness, severe mental health needs, learning disabilities, and everything else. That means that trauma is always going to be a part of this sector. And I think for many, many years, we've kind of done that mindset of this is the job and we've just got to get on with it. And we can't anymore, because people's mental capacity to help others and to look at it is just running out. And certainly those I speak with are constantly saying to me, Matt, I'm just exhausted. I just have nothing more to give, but I still love this sector. I'm caught in this mindset balance of trying to help more and not being able to. Moving into the kind of last couple of minutes, Darren, and thoughts for yourself on, I know you've mentioned there a couple of times, taking that bigger picture and stepping back. What would be, you've mentioned a couple of times, I guess, the quick wins. What are the quick, a couple of quick wins that people can take away today? Because anyone who comes to the roundtable always want to say there's something you can take away that you can really kind of go, right, we can start this now and start making an impact. So what are those couple of quick wins that people can do to go, actually,
Well, I think
start the journey.
What we haven't talked about is self-care, and I had that on the slides. I'll send these slides through because people will find them helpful. But you know, we're talking about trauma informed, but we're talking about trauma within organisations, and it sounds like housing is definitely one of those sectors. And actually, we've got to look after ourselves first. And if we can't look after ourselves, how we expect to look after other people? And I think that's the core elements of it. So self-care and thinking about self-care in all its assets in terms of safety, physical, emotional, social, spiritual, just thinking about those aspects is really important. In terms of some of the practical quick wins, I've talked about, you know, wellbeing meetings. If you don't have them, I suggest put them in and start working on those. It doesn't matter if you've got a clinician there, as long as there's somebody at the management level that can facilitate those meetings. Because what you want to do is to create a space where people feel that they can speak openly and honestly and start to feel trust within the team they're working in. That isn't going to happen straight away. I remember the first meeting I had, and you could have cut the atmosphere with a knife. And it took time, but within 12 months, my staff were there asking me, when are the meetings taking place? So it can change, but you just need to do it really incrementally over a bit of time, but start putting some of these things in place. If you're not doing reflective supervision, then that needs to happen as well for some of the staff as well. If your staff are motivated, well, resilient, then the outcomes for your tenants will be better and greater. So your staffing is key to it for me in terms of making sure people are looked after. But if you're working in a broken system, which again sounds like that is because the pressures demands not enough staff, then actually that makes it much more difficult to do.
If anybody needs to talk about staffing or anything along those lines, this is literally what I do for 11 years. So do come and talk to me about it. I very rarely plug this side of things, but this is 100% what it's about. And culture is the key word, I think, in housing across the board at the moment. Anna has said in the chat there, she also recommends really spending some time to understand, to get around the understanding of home as an emotional place. Tarot Trust have recently done some research on understanding how residents feel about themselves, their homes, and the impact that housing services have on this. So again, let's circulate that. Let's get some information out around that, because anybody who is working in this sector and is exhausted, then you know, there is support out there. It's about going, right, we've got you and we're going to all look after each other here, but let's do it collectively. I'm aware we're running out of time and that there's apparently motorbikes flying past my house, so apologies if that kind of echo through. So thank you everybody for attending today. Thank you, Darren, for bringing the conversation to the table. Next week does kind of tie in with it. To those who know Honey Premlau, we're going to be talking about harassment, target setting and performance management in the modern age of social housing. And again, this ties into this whole mental health piece that we're trying to focus on at the moment, because it's absolutely imperative. But if anyone is here today listening on the podcast, which is now on Spotify, listening to YouTube, whatever it might be, and can reach out to Hazel or anyone else who with ideas of what they're doing to really have an impact on this sector and on, I guess, trying to deal, I guess, with the trauma that everyone's going through, then please do, because it'd be great to hear some more wins coming through. But for now, Darren, yes?
Just final note, I mentioned at the beginning, NHS Scotland transformation around trauma, their framework could be applied to your sector. You know, it's all been written, it's all there, and it could be lifted and adapted and tried to be embedded. So again, I would be referring people to that piece of work that they've done.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody, and hopefully see you next week or at future roundtables. But for now, thank you, Darren, and thank you, everybody, for today. Cheers.
Thanks. Bye-bye.